Well, welcome, Philip. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to discuss some of your ideas. And most of our conversation will probably fall into the category of philosophy of mind, at least as pictured by Western philosophy in particular. And perhaps we could begin with something very basic, which is two principal theories of philosophy of mind that have been prevalent in the academic world are called dualism and materialism. Could you begin by just explaining what those two visions are?
Thanks, Richard. Well, thanks for having me on. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I think that is very much a good place to start. Actually, when I studied philosophy 20 years ago, when I was an undergraduate, we were taught that these were the only two options on consciousness. So, very roughly, I suppose, dualism is the view that consciousness is non physical, outside of the physical workings of the body or the brain. Maybe it's in the soul, for example, which is something separate from the body or the brain. Whereas materialism, also known as physicalism, is the view that consciousness is, in some sense, a purely physical phenomenon. It can be wholly explained in the terms of physical science, neuroscience. Maybe it can be understood in terms of electrochemical signaling, for example. So these are the two dominant rival options, which I think still continue to dominate in mainstream Western Anglophone philosophy.
Very good. Thank you. I mean, both of those views, of course, have some serious objections. The objection to the dualist view is often that, well, if mind and matter are separate, what connects them? Well, how are they connected at all, if at all? And, Descartes, I guess, is the principal exponent of that theory, and his views have been certainly critiqued. The materialist view, the physicalist view, has a problem in that, well, for one thing, it hasn't explained what it wants to explain. You just said everything can be explained by neuroscience and so on, but it hasn't been. It's merely promissory, and they've been making that promise for a long time now. So your view, I believe, differs from both of those in certain important respects. So let's go on to your picture of the matter.
Well, I defend a view known as panpsychism that, again, when I was studying philosophy as an undergraduate, was not on the table at all. And it's been very exciting, really, in the last 10 to 15 years that it's come to the fore as a serious option in mainstream Anglophone philosophy. And it's been very exciting to be part of that, as well as some parts of neuroscience more generally, in fact. Very roughly, it's the view that consciousness goes all the way down to the fundamental building blocks of physical reality. It's a question for physics, what physical reality is made up of. Perhaps it's made up of fields, perhaps it's made up of tiny fundamental particles like electrons and quarks. But whichever turn out to be the case, what the panpsychist claims is those basic building blocks of physical reality have very rudimentary forms of conscious experience, and that the very complex experience of the human or animal brain is somehow built up from these more basic forms of consciousness at the fundamental level of physics. So in some ways, it's attractive to many increasingly as a sort of middle way between those two more conventional options of dualism and materialism. Unlike materialism, it really takes consciousness seriously as an irreducible fundamental feature of reality. It doesn't try to explain it in terms of something else. But unlike dualism, it's perhaps a more simple, elegant, unified theory of reality. It doesn't say reality's divided up into these two radically different kinds of thing, which, as you say, Richard, we might then worry, well, how do they connect up? It says, no. At the fundamental level, there's just simple forms of consciousness, and everything else builds up from there.
Mhm. Well, one early proponent of that view was actually Thomas Edison, who in an 1890 interview said, uh, he's talking about matter and atoms, such as they were known at the time. He said, look at all of the intricate ways in which these substances react and interact. Do you mean to tell me they do this without some form of, I believe he used the word intelligence? So the idea is that a hydrogen atom must, as I understand it, somehow be able to recognize an oxygen atom when it's in the vicinity and then react in it in, the usual chemical ways. Is that something like what you're trying to say?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, it did used to be much more of a mainstream view in earlier generations, in something of a heyday in the 19th century. I mean, panpsychism has always been part of philosophy in both West and East, going back as far as we know about philosophy, and key figures in the scientific revolution and connected philosophy. People like Leibniz, Spinoza were prominent panpsychists. It's a very good book by the philosopher David Skirabina called Panpsychism in the West, where he said how radically widespread panpsychism has been in the history of Western philosophy. But yeah, I suppose that's the idea. So it's not. Sometimes it's mischaracterized as that something like a fundamental particle has two different kinds of property. It's got all its physical properties like mass and spin and charge, and these separate consciousness properties. The physicist Sabine Hossenfelder has caricatured panpsychism like that, and I've responded to her in some work. But that would be dualism again, right? It would be an odd kind of dualism, but again, we'd have that radical divide this time, just at the level of electrons and quarks. But the panpsychism aims for a much more unified theory than that. Actually, I mean, you can think of it as sort of turning materialism on its head. So whereas the materialist starts with physical stuff and tries to get consciousness out of that, as you say, Richard, we've never had any much success at that. I would argue it's actually an incoherent project. The panpsychist tries to do it the other way around. Start with simple forms of consciousness and get physical reality out of those more basic forms of consciousness. So that's the attraction. It's simple, elegant, unified. And I think actually we know how to, in contrast to materialism, where we've had this never-ending explanatory failure, I think we have worked out how to make sense of panpsychism. We've worked out how to account for physical reality in terms of simple forms of consciousness. I think the reason it's not more mainstream than it is just it sort of feels a bit weird, goes against our current cultural assumptions, but that isn't really a very good argument, is it?
Oh, no. Perhaps we could discuss one very basic issue, which is what is consciousness anyway? How are you defining consciousness in the context of your thought?
Yeah, an important question. Philosophers always like to get very clear on how we're using words. Hopefully, we go beyond the meanings of words, but it's a good starting point to get very precise about these things. The way I use consciousness, which is pretty standard, I think, is just consciousness meaning subjective experience. Your consciousness is what it's like to be you. Now, what it's like to be a human being like you or I is very, very rich and complex. We're lucky enough to be the result of millions and millions of years of evolution. But subjective experience comes in lots of shapes and sizes, right? So what it's like to be a human being is complex. What it's like to be a sheep is simpler, still very complex, but simpler. What it's like to be a snail, simpler still. And as we move to simpler and simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of conscious experience. So for the panpsychist, this keeps going down, right down to the fundamental building blocks of matter, with electrons and quarks, if they are the fundamental things, having very, very basic forms of experience. So it's not saying an electron has conceptual thought or awareness of its own existence. It's not suffering existential angst or something. It just has some very, very crude form of experience.
Very good. Thank you. Well, one philosophical term that seems to be used for is what's it like is qualia, which is a plural form. And qualia seems to be what's it like to be so and so and so and so on. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, this is a very influential phrase from the philosopher Thomas Nagel in his very influential paper, What's It Like to Be a Bat in the 1970s. I just say it's from Nagel. It's associated with Nagel, and perhaps Nagel was the first to explicitly use it to define consciousness. But talking of consciousness in these terms goes back much further, including Timothy Sprigg, who was a very influential panpsychist earlier in the 20th century. He was perhaps basically the only one in the UK. It's probably a slight exaggeration, but at least in my philosophical tradition of, broadly speaking, Anglophone philosophy, he was in Edinburgh University still defending panpsychism when pretty much no one else did. I was actually I'm too young to have ever met him, but one of my first conferences I went to as a PhD student was a memorial conference in his honor. Or was it when I was my first year of lecturing, perhaps? And it was very exciting because I remember one of the talks mentioned a paper of mine, my only paper at the time. It was so exciting to hear your work talked about. But yes, so as I like to put it, your consciousness is what it's like to be you. And the term qualia is in somewhat in different ways. These days I find actually it's increasingly used more by people who don't like it, who don't believe in it. But so people might just say consciousness or phenomenal consciousness is sometimes used to capture this, what it's likeness idea of consciousness. But qualia is fine too. I mean, sometimes qualia can be used to refer to the qualities of our conscious experience, the colors, the sounds, the smells, and the tastes. This is one aspect of what's so difficult to capture in the purely quantitative language of physical science. How can we capture these qualities, the redness of a red experience in this purely quantitative mathematical language of physical science? And in fact, well, I've written in my book Galileo's Error, for example, about how the father of modern science, in a way, the person who invented physical science, Galileo, back in the 17th century, was very aware of this. And because of this, he explicitly defined, created, designed physical science to exclude consciousness with its mysterious qualities so that everything else could be captured in purely mathematical quantitative language. And that was kind of a good move, right? That was the start of physical science. But we've sort of forgotten that whole project was focused on a limited focus subject matter, one that excluded consciousness. And we now think, oh, it's gone so well, of course it's going to explain consciousness. Well, no, it's gone so well because it was designed to exclude consciousness. If we now want to bring consciousness fully into the scientific story, I think we need to rethink those intellectual foundations bequeathed to us by Galileo. We need to bring together what Galileo separated, and I think panpsychism is one way of doing that.
Well, that's very interesting. A historical question about Galileo. Do you believe that he excluded things such as consciousness from his physical model because he really thought it was the best thing to do, or because it was the easiest way to keep the church out of his hair?
A good question. Well, I must say, I suppose I'm not a scholar on all the details of Galileo, and yeah, it's somewhat difficult sometimes to know exactly what he was getting at with certain schematic remarks. But I mean, one thing to say is he certainly believed in consciousness. He wasn't denying the existence of it. So he said that consciousness, with its qualities, the colors, the sounds, the smells, and the tastes, existed in what he called the animation of the body. He thought there was a special incorporeal animation which goes beyond matter in the sense that it's studied by what he called natural philosophy, what we now call physical science. So it was a sort of conception of the soul closer to Aristotle than Plato. So in the history of things, you've got Plato, Socrates inspired Plato, and then Plato taught Aristotle. So Plato had more how we think of the soul now as something sort of separable from the body. But for Aristotle, the soul was not physical exactly, but it was the form of the body. So it wasn't something that could exist separate from the body, but nor was it reducible to physical processes in the body. And it seems like Galileo thought of it something like in that way. I mean, my own belief about it is that he understood quite correctly. I think that you can't capture these qualities of experience in the purely quantitative language of physical science, but he saw the benefit of having a purely mathematical science. Once we get that going, a little bit later, we get Newton's equation of gravity, that wonderful, simple equation capturing so much about the dynamics of heaven and earth. And the balls kept rolling ever since. So it was a good move, maybe a sort of a temporary stopgap, a holding point. Let's just put consciousness on one side for the moment. We can make some progress. I suppose I now think we're at a stage where we can maybe unify things a bit more. And hopefully we're getting a bit closer to that.
Well, you suggest that Galileo decided to put consciousness on the side in creating his physical model. But of course, that's quite different from categorically denying that consciousness exists, which seems to be the ultimate upshot of this materialist position. And Daniel Dennett, who seems to be the, grand, high exalted mystic ruler of materialism, I think said in one of his books, "I flatly deny that there's any such thing as qualia." So far from setting it aside, and now we are in the realm of philosophy, which shouldn't set this aside. There's just a categorical denial of basically our own most intimate and profound day-to-day experience.
Yeah, well, I knew Daniel Dennett very well. In fact, I spent a week on a boat with him in the Arctic on a very interesting philosophy event, traveling around Greenland for a week, talking about consciousness. And I actually persuaded him he was wrong about something, and talk about that in my book. Something small, but significant, I think. And just we were debating on BBC Radio, actually, just before he passed away, when our two books came out more or less the same time, and we had a little friendly spirited debate. But yes, so it gets a bit tricky. Does he deny consciousness? Doesn't he deny consciousness? I'm inclined to think, and David Chalmers has said this too, that in earlier work, he was more radical, saying consciousness just doesn't exist. And then as time went on, he was more sort of, well, it exists in a sense, but philosophers misunderstand it. It exists in one sense, in another sense, it doesn't. I mean, here's what we can say. Insofar as he thought consciousness existed, it was something that's defined purely behaviorally. Just a matter of behavior, not just external behavior, but behavior of bits inside your brain as well. But that was all he meant by consciousness. It's something that can be entirely cashed out in terms of inner and outer behavior, something in that sense entirely mechanistic. And I just think that's not what we mean. What just ordinary people. If I talk about my wife feeling pain. That is not a claim about her behavior or the behavior of her parts. I mean, there's a nuance here. It's obviously feelings are closely related to behavior. When you're in pain, you behave a distinctive way. Still, the point is the claim that someone is in pain is not just a claim about their behavior or the behavior of their parts. It's a claim about how they feel. It's just a very different kind of thing. And I think this is actually, once you appreciate this, that's the way into seeing why actually the whole materialist project is incoherent, I think, because which what materialist science, what physical science is good at, what it's all about, what it's been in the business of since Galileo, is explaining behavior, publicly observable behavior. That's what it's good at. You take a system and water boiling at a certain temperature, and you explain that behavior in terms of simpler behavior, the behavior of molecules, the behavior of atoms, get down to particles, but it's all about explaining behavior. But when you're trying to explain consciousness, that's not exactly what you're doing. You're not trying to explain why a system behaves a certain way. You're trying to explain why it feels a certain way. And that's just a different kind of explanatory project. So I think it's a little bit like saying, imagine someone says, telescopes have been brilliant at looking at the stars. Let's apply them in pure mathematics as well. Well, there's just two completely different explanatory projects. I think it's the same with this idea that we can, physical science has gone really well. Let's apply it to consciousness. Physical science has gone really well explaining how things behave. But when we're interested in explaining how things feel, that's just a very different explanatory project. Although, to be fair to Dennett, he was at least coherent in just sort of saying, oh, it just doesn't exist. If by consciousness you're meaning something more than just mechanistic behavior, then it doesn't exist. Okay, that's a coherent position. And my friend Keith Frankish, who is a big fan of Dennett, who I do my Mind Chat YouTube channel with, he says the same. It just, insofar as you mean something other than just behavior by consciousness, it just doesn't exist. Whereas most materialists want to have their cake and eat it. They want to say, oh no, we believe in feelings and experiences, qualia, just like you do. But we just think physical science can explain them. This project that's always just been about explaining behavior. So there's that more mainstream physicalist position that I think just doesn't really make sense at the end of the day. So at least Dennett was consistent, although it's a bit bonkers, isn't it, to deny that consciousness exists.
Well, yeah, that's kind of it reminds me, a couple of months ago, I interviewed a professor of religious studies. We discussed this issue, and he objected to the materialist position by saying, well, materialists say we can explain everything on the table. And his response was, that's because you've taken everything you can't explain off the table to begin with. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that remark. So you can't explain what consciousness is, so you deny its existence. Bonkers is as good a way of describing it as any. Let's go on. I mean, much of Western thought, in the 19th and 20th centuries has been highly, shall we say, externalistic. Observing behavior, observing external results, either denying subjective experience or explaining it all away. And this has kind of left us with an extremely cold and depressing world. So could you talk a little bit about what you believe the larger social consequences of this kind of materialist position?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think that does get to the nub of it. Really, we've taken this project that's been very good at this very specific, limited thing, and we've tried to apply it everywhere. And I mean, I can understand what's going on, because when you've got something that has worked so well, and you just want to think, oh, we found it, we found the answers, and everything else feels a bit intangible and insubstantial. But unfortunately, you see where that ends up when you end up sort of denying what is most evident, the reality of our own feelings and experiences. Where does this end? Where does this end up? Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I mean, it's often remarked on that what people think of as the scientific picture does seem so disenchanted. It doesn't seem to be a picture of reality that we know our place within, that we fit into. I mean, the reality of consciousness being one part of that, but also agency, free will, free will being something that's perhaps less undeniable than consciousness, less of a certainty, perhaps, but also something I think is fundamentally a part of how we understand ourselves as human beings. And I don't really think there are good scientific reasons to be skeptical of it. I think this is more of a dogma. So increasingly, we strip away different layers of our being and are left with a picture of reality we don't recognize. I mean, physics at the moment. I'm in awe of physics in so many ways, but the picture of reality many theoretical physicists end up with is a very strange, esoteric picture of reality where it based not only is there no consciousness or free will, but there's not even space and time at the fundamental level. I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to see how we connect the world as we experience it to the world that theoretical physicists are discussing. And this is why I think in all these things, we need to get back to philosophy as it was always understood. I see the project of philosophy as one of synthesis, bringing together different ways in which we know about reality. Yes, taking experiments and physical science very seriously, but bringing that into harmony with other things we know about ourselves. So, I think there are alternatives that don't involve a clash with our scientific view of the world. There is no clash between panpsychism and our best science, and I think it's a worldview that's got very strong arguments in support of it, but it's also a worldview I think that is slightly better for our mental and spiritual health. It's a picture of the universe in which we fit into. We understand our place in it. We are conscious creatures in a conscious universe. I think it fits much better with how we ordinarily engage with nature. I mean, on a physicalist or materialist worldview, plants and trees are largely understood as mechanisms. But do any of us really relate to plants and trees as mechanisms? I think we feel of these living systems as having intrinsic value in their own right, as being sources of inherent worth, not just complicated mechanisms. For a panpsychist, hugging a tree makes a lot more sense if you're a panpsychist, right? It doesn't really make sense to hug a mechanism, does it? So, I think it does offer, it's a way of bringing together aspects of our existence which are evident, hard to deny, even impossible to deny, but also aspects of our existence which are so important for our mental and spiritual health, I think.
Well, that raises an interesting question because it would seem that the environmental crisis in all its many forms seems to be the precise consequence of treating plants and animals as mechanisms, as simple resources to be exploited. And I think it's fairly obvious that the genuine dangers of this approach are fairly obvious. Would you agree with that?
I do think that if a tree is just a mechanism, then it has no value in its own right. It's valuable because of what it does for us, looking pretty, or more importantly, sustaining our existence. But it doesn't have value in its own right. Whereas if you're a panpsychist, and a tree is a conscious entity, albeit of a very different form to us, then a tree has moral significance in its own right. If you see horrible images of burning forests, I mean, many of us are horrified by that, but it adds an extra moral dimension if you see this as burning of conscious organisms. So, yeah, I mean, and the more we've just learned about this, the straight science with trees, the more we've learned that there is a buzzing, blooming community of interconnected conscious beings beneath the ground as you walk through a forest that are sharing information, sharing nutrients, older trees passing on information to younger trees, um, cross species participation, cross species assistance, quid pro quo. I mean, human beings find cross racial cooperation challenging, but trees manage it across species with the trees that keep their leaves during the winter, sharing some nutrients with the trees that lose them, and then it being reciprocated the other half of the year. Absolutely fascinating. I mean, much of this science was ridiculed as sort of hippie nonsense in its early days, but is pretty much uh, mainstream science now. Um, Also, experiments on pea plants being capable of being subject to conditioned learning. People know about Pavlov's dog, the classic experiment where they got the dog to associate the ringing of the bell with eating dinner, and they start salivating with the ringing of the bell. Well, we've managed to do that with pea plants, associated the ultraviolet light they feed on with the humming of a computer fan or something, so it grows in that direction. So yeah, I think it's a one of my PhD students who's recently finished as gesturing at how this is a much more productive um, ways of engaging scientifically with the natural world, and perhaps its fruits have not yet been fully realized. There's lots of potential there. I mean, in terms of spirituality more generally as well, um, I suppose in many cultures, people have mystical experiences that suggest to them there is some higher form of consciousness at the root of things, or pervading all of nature. One of the boxes you tick on the psychological test for having a mystical experience is there um, a living presence, a sense of a living presence in all things. And now, if you're a physicalist, you have to say, oh, that's sort of a delusion. That's just some weird chemistry going on that causes that. But if you're a panpsychist and you already think reality is pervaded by consciousness, it's not so much of a leap to take seriously what seems to be evident to you in a mystical experience, to take that higher form of consciousness to be part of the consciousness that you already take to fill all of nature. Now, we can't be too quick here. There's much to debate here. Some panpsychists would want to stop short of any of that, would want to say, no, I don't believe in spiritual mystical experiences. I'm just talking about a new scientific paradigm for explaining consciousness. But there's at least more consonance with a panpsychist worldview and certain mainstream spiritual convictions.
Well, you mentioned one of your students, and it would be interesting to learn what you have learned from teaching philosophy at this point. What do the students come to you with? What issues are they grappling with? What do they go away with, not only in terms of philosophical conclusions, but in ways of leading their own lives? Do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, well, I love teaching. It's such an honor to be able to engage with students at all levels of their study and beyond, and to see where they end up. I've just a couple of weeks ago actually examined a very good PhD, um, let me oversimplify a little bit. Roughly, the project was, has science ruled out the soul? So it wasn't actually panpsychism. It was more Descartes' view of the soul interacting with the mind and the brain. Sorry, interacting with the body and the brain. Um, and it was absolutely wonderful, extraordinary bit of work because I think so many people just think, oh, of course it has, of course science, and make very sort of sweeping statements. But this PhD went into cutting edge physics, cutting edge neuroscience, engaging with some work. Sean Carroll, a paper Sean Carroll wrote actually for a special issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies that I edited. That's the theoretical physicist Sean Carroll. And I mean, I co-examined it with a leading philosopher of physics who has, no time for the soul as a materialist, a physicist, and they were also very impressed with this cutting edge piece of work. I hope to talk more about that actually. So I suppose the issues are still being finalized with this doctorate. But yeah, I mean, I love it. So many of my students disagree with me. So many of them start defending panpsychism and then say, no, I'm not finding this convincing, and go off in a slightly different direction. That's wonderful too. These are difficult questions, inherently challenging, uncertain questions, and we work in constructive dialogue and debate, including with my students. And a couple of nights ago, I was out on a termly social with our undergraduate students, having a walk around some local gardens, having a drink afterwards, and yeah, seeing how they're wrestling, young minds wrestling with the mind, with God, with ethics. And often when it's younger students or the general public, it can be that you get a sort of academic group think, and everyone in the academic group think are making the same assumptions. And then an undergraduate student asks a question, left field question, and it's just like, oh my God, just questioning some of those assumptions that you've just been taken for granted. So yes, it's an honor. It's a privilege. Sometimes a bit difficult to keep all these things going, though. The right academic writing, popular writing, teaching students, having young children. That's the hardest thing in my life, is keeping all these things going. But that's a bit of a first world problem, isn't it? I shouldn't really complain.
Well, I think, if you start looking at life as a whole, it seems to me that life is easy for exactly nobody, no matter who you are, but maybe that's an overgeneralization. Well, I mean, many of the things you said and, the philosophical stance you've taken does seem to have bearing on issues like theology, spirituality, areas with which certainly many 20th century philosophers, Anglo-American philosophers, have found very, very uncomfortable and just wanted to avoid. So could you talk a little bit about what you personally see as the spiritual implications of the ideas you're expounding?
Yeah, I suppose as time has gone on, my work has gone more in this direction. Um, I guess I started off as an undergraduate being a physicalist, a materialist, wanting to defend what I thought of as the credible scientific view, and even when I was a panpsychist, initially having a very sort of reductionist, secular atheist version of that. There is a bit of a split in the panpsychist research community. Some people take it in a very secular reductionist direction. Other people see this consonance with certain spiritual issues. But I mean, one thing that's preoccupied me in recent years is the so-called fine-tuning of physics for life. This surprising discovery of recent decades that for life to be possible, certain numbers in physics had to fall in this incredibly narrow range. Like Goldilocks porridge, sort of not too big, not too small, exactly right. So, for example, dark energy, the force that propels the accelerating expansion of the universe that we discovered in 1998. I remember it as a science enthused teenager when we discovered this. So we now know if that force, the force that propels the expansion of the universe, if it had been a little bit stronger, everything would have shot apart so quickly. No two particles would have ever met. We wouldn't have had stars, planets, any kind of structural complexity. Whereas if it had been a little bit smaller, it wouldn't have counteracted gravity, and the whole universe would have collapsed within a split second of the Big Bang. So it's really sort of finely balanced in this area, and it seems wildly improbable that you'd get the right number just by chance. And there are many numbers like this in physics. So I think this is pretty clear evidence for some kind of goal directedness, purposive activity, movement towards life in the early universe. And I think we're kind of in denial about it because we've got so used to thinking science has ruled out that kind of thing. It sounds too goddish, to the point where we're just sort of, when evidence like this comes up, which is not, I'm not talking about fringe science. I wouldn't engage with fringe physics. I just don't have the skill set to do that. This is mainstream physics, but I think we're just ignoring where it's pointing evidentially. I mean, incidentally, I don't myself go for the very traditional idea of God because I'm also worried about the big problem with the mainstream idea of God. Suffering. Why would an all-loving, all-powerful God create a world of so much suffering? So I think in a way, what I've come to think, and this led to my book, Why the Purpose of the Universe, I think both mainstream belief in God and mainstream atheism both have things about reality they can't explain. And we've got stuck in this dichotomy. Like, which team are you on? Richard Dawkins or the Pope? One of these has to be right. But actually, they both have aspects of reality they can't explain. And there's a wide range of in-between options that we're kind of ignoring. I'm always the middle way guy. I'm always interested in these neglected middle way options. So in the Why book, I was really trying to lay out and explore some of these middle way options.
Mhm. Yeah, I think what you say points to one concern in the scientific, materialistic, philosophical world that there's kind of this conscious or unconscious fear of a slippery slope. That if you let something like an idea of God creep into your calculations, you're going to be back with Christianity, the Apostles' Creed, and all that stuff. And who wants to go back to that? So I think there's just kind of almost a gut fear of being sent back to the Middle Ages by even admitting the idea of such things as God. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think definitely something like that's going on. But I mean, ironically, it's supposed to be religious people who have bias. I think you're trained in intellectual circles in the West to think, religious people have this bias. They just want to believe in God. But I think all of us can be subject to bias. And I mean, I found it very hard for a long time to stand up in front of my peers and talk about this evidence that I think points to some kind of goal directedness in nature, because I feel silly. I feel, and I've got an old childhood friend of mine who says, "Oh, you just believe in these things because you were raised Catholic." And I think, like, I rejected Catholicism when I was 14, refused to get confirmed, upset my grandmother. I think what has a bigger peer influence on me is more a mainstream secular atheist perspective. But look, I mean, we just have to continuously wrestle with ourselves and
Mhm.
wrestle with these biases and struggle to, as best we can, impartially assess the evidence and the arguments. And, I daily have a monologue in my head trying to raise the best objections to my view. But actually, more recently, since the Why book came out, well, I've gone public as self-identifying as a heretical Christian because actually I've Well, I suppose part of this is discovering actually the mystical traditions of Christianity, the mystical traditions actually of all the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism and Islam as well. Um, you know, when I in my Catholic upbringing, I thought Christianity was all about sin and punishment, and it's all about, we all deserve to burn in hell, but Jesus paid the price for our sins, so we're all good. But actually, I mean, that was largely, never mind Catholicism, that was largely an invention of the Protestant reformers 500 years ago. And actually, these mystical traditions, particularly pronounced, for example, in the Eastern Church, which go right back to the start, as far as we can make out, involve the idea that it's not about sin and punishment fundamentally. It's all about God and the universe coming into oneness, coming into unity. So I discovered these ways of thinking about Christianity that resonate much more with me spiritually. So that's the kind of the hard stuff, but also I think fit well with some of these alternative middle way understandings of God. So that was the sort of head part of it. So, these are all very uncertain. I don't think life is very uncertain. I think of spiritual or religious engagement as about a decision to trust, a certain view and work with it in how you understand and act on your spiritual experiences. But I have returned in that sense to a form of Christianity. Actually, I think I was saying recently, I think I've found my home with the combination of the mysticism of the Eastern Church and the liberal flexibility of the Anglican or Episcopal Church. We call it the Anglican Church in the US, you call it the Episcopal Church. So that, I mean, the Anglican or Episcopal Church, it's very flexible. No one's going to sort of interrogate you for your beliefs. And if it was just that, then that would be a bit sort of wishy-washy and nothingness. But with the core spirituality that I've discerned from the Eastern Church, combining the two, so having that core, deep, resonating mysticism, but being a little bit flexible, I can interpret it in my own way. Well, I'm interested, increasingly interested in the mystical traditions in all the great religions. And I mean, the book I'm just working on at the moment, got a deadline in the end of the summer. Just exploring the mystical traditions in all the big religions and exploring ways in which people can engage with traditional religion in a way that avoids the worries they might have, worries about dogmatic certainty, worries about clash with science, worries about old-fashioned morality or something. Encouraging people that you can be a bit heretical, you can be very uncertain, you can take it all to be a big metaphor if you like. But there are, I think, things you can get out of religion or spiritual practice, such as community, structure, tradition. And if there are ways of engaging with it that avoid some of these worries, then, I think there's possibilities that are being neglected. That's always what I've tried to do in my work. We get stuck in these dichotomies. Let's explore these possibilities that have been neglected, such as engaging in a slightly more liberal, mystical way with our mainstream religions like Christianity or Islam.
Well, very good. I mean, speaking personally, I think if you and I were to talk further, we'd find that we had a lot more that we agreed upon than that we disagreed upon. But who knows? Anyway, well, let's cut it off here. It's been great. You've done a great job. Thank you so much, Philip.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's been really good fun.